AgileTO would like to introduce our guest for tonight. He's celebrating a bit of an anniversary this year. He started the very first Agile group, XP Toronto, exactly 20 years ago. He's been in software development throughout his career and is a longtime coach and trainer who has helped and continues to help clients all over North America, with an occasional jaunt to other places in the world. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Gargoyle himself, Mike Boyle. Mike.
Thank you, Heron. Let me just get the slides up. So we're going to be talking about clean language today. Clean language, first of all, let's just establish what it is and it isn't. A lot of people hear the term and they think they understand instinctively what I mean by clean language. They think that it's something to do with profanity or about happier, more positive wording. And let me assure you, it has nothing to do with that. It's a very specific pattern for enabling deeper, more meaningful conversations. We're trying to get past superficial conversations and into something a little bit deeper as quickly as we can. This is a technique that comes from therapy, and it's used today in coaching to help people solve their own problems. A fundamental assumption of coaching is that the client already has the answer inside them, and they just don't know how to get to it. Clean language is a way to help us get there. So before we get into that, there's 3 quick bits of theory. The first bit of theory is that words direct attention. I'd like you to pay attention now, if you can, to your breathing. Begin to notice how you're breathing, whether you're breathing shallowly or deeply, you're breathing in or you're breathing out. And as you're doing that, you'll notice that your attention has just come to your breathing. And now as you begin to notice what's underneath you, whether you're standing or sitting, the surfaces underneath them, the feel of yourself on those surfaces. And now as your attention has gone there, you've probably forgotten all about the breathing, although I hope that you've continued to do it. This is just to point out that the words draw your attention to wherever it is I'm trying to draw them to. And that's critically important for clean language because we're using specific language patterns to draw people's attention to the things that we care about. The second bit of theory that I care about is this distinction between thoughts and thinking. It's a distinction that I learned from a hypnosis trainer, Igor Ledachovsky. And a thought is something, it's a preformed idea that we can just bring back right away. For example, I ask somebody, what day it is, they might just come back with an answer right away. They don't have to calculate it. Whereas thinking is a more deliberate process of coming up with the answer. So let me give you a concrete example of this. I'm going to pick on John for a moment because I can see him right here. And imagine that I'm meeting John for the first time at a conference, and I come up to him, I say, "Hi, my name is Mike, and who are you?" He's probably going to say, "I'm John," because he didn't have to think about that. He didn't have to look at his name badge. He didn't have to think, what did my parents call me when I was younger? He automatically knows the answer. It's a thought. But instead, imagine for a moment that I'm meeting John for the first time. We're at a conference, and I say, "Hey, I see from your name tag that your name is John, but who are you really?" Now, if you can see John's face right now, he's got a smile on, he can see right away what I'm doing. I'm trying to force him into the deeper state. I'm trying to force him to think, not just give me back a regurgitated thought. This again is critical to clean language, because if I ask a superficial question, people will give me back a superficial answer. If I ask something a bit deeper, I'll be able to dig a bit deeper and get into those deeper pieces. The third and final bit of theory we've got here is metaphors and how critical they are to the way we store information. Our brains cannot store a single piece of information in isolation. It has to be linked to something that's already there. And a metaphor is just describing one thing in terms of another thing. And our brains are deeply, deeply wired for metaphor. So metaphors might be things like, that story sent chills down my spine, or my head was exploding with new ideas. Now, I don't mean that my head truly exploded. That would be a bad thing. It's a metaphor. I'm explaining something in terms of another thing. And sometimes those metaphors are really obvious, like exploding with new ideas. And sometimes they're really subtle, like I have a lot of bananas. A lot is actually a unit of measure, but we're not using it in that context. We're using it as a metaphor to compare something to something else. So metaphors are critically important. We average about 6 metaphors a minute. There was a study done that I've referenced here that talks about how often we're using these metaphors. And the first time I heard this, I thought this was ridiculous. I thought there's no way that there's that many metaphors coming out of my mouth. And now that I pay attention to what I say, I think I actually use more metaphors than that, because they're all the time coming out of our mouths. We're using them absolutely constantly, just coming out of my mouth. Well, the words didn't actually do that. And yet that's what I said. So the next thing about metaphors is that if I'm talking to somebody, let's say I'm talking to John again, and he says that story just sent chills down my spine. And I say, tell me more about how you were scared. Now I've contaminated his metaphor. And what I mean by that is that I've given him back a word that was different from the word he used. And I've tried, now his brain is trying to think, are chills the same as scared? Is it the same thing? Is it different? And his brain is spiraling off and trying to think about different things. And this is not what we want to do with clean language. We do not want to contaminate the metaphors. So instead, we would give a language pattern like this. If the subject said that story sent chills down my spine, I might say, what kind of chills? Or what kind of chills are those chills? These questions are clean, and they're clean because the only metaphor in them is the exact metaphor that the client gave me, repeated back verbatim in their words. What kind of chills are those chills? So this is the key, the essence of clean language, is that I'm asking a question that only echoes back the metaphor you gave me without contaminating it. And if we do that, it will help you understand in your own thinking. It will help you go deeper and solve the problem yourself that you were trying to solve. So a bit of a disclaimer here. If you find yourself ever giving advice or explaining what you think somebody's metaphor means, you're doing it wrong. This is not about you. This is about the client. And when we use their metaphors exactly as it was and pass them back exactly as it was, they will get to a better understanding of their own thinking, whether or not you understand what's going on in their mind, because often you won't. If they say to you, I felt like I was sliding down the slope, you may never know what that sliding meant to them, but they know. And if you ask questions around it, then they will get to a deeper understanding. So remember, your job is to help them unpack their own thinking, not to solve their problems for you. This is the essence of coaching. So these are the clean language questions. These are the primary questions. Now, as I said, anything that does not contaminate the metaphor is by definition clean, but the clean language packaging contains these. These are the base questions that come with it. What kind of X is that X? Is there anything else about X? Where is X? Is there a relationship between them? These first two, if you've heard of the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, these two here are the 20% of clean language that give you 80% of the value. You could do nothing but ask these same two questions over and over again, and you will get some significant value out of this language pattern. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't try to use the others, because you're going to get bored if you're asking the same two questions over and over again, but you will get the vast majority of the value just by asking these two. Judy Reese, who wrote the book Clean Language, refers to these as the lazy Jedi questions, because you're just saying a few words and you're getting tremendous benefit in the client just by asking these. So let's look at an example. Somebody says to me, I've been struggling with that problem. Well, what kind of struggling is that? Struggling is if I were tangled in a bunch of ropes and couldn't get free. We've now got three metaphors on the page that we can work with. Is there anything else about those ropes? I just picked one at random. They're heavy, I can't get out. What kind of heavy is that? We're now at 4 metaphors in just a small sequence of questions. I could start picking apart any one of those. So I'm not continually asking what kind of X is that for the same metaphor. I might start doing it for different metaphors and mixing it up and trying to get the client to look at their own problem from all different angles. You'll notice that there's a couple where there's an X and a Y, and that's because I'm comparing 2 metaphors. So if I started with the example, I'm feeling stuck in my new role. You're feeling stuck. What kind of stuck is that? Like I'm sinking in quicksand, second metaphor. Is there anything else about that sinking? I feel like I can't breathe, third metaphor. So now I'm going to link the two. I'm going to say, is there a relationship between being stuck and not being able to breathe? Or when you're stuck, what happens to that sinking in quicksand feeling? So I can start to map relationships, and I can ask, are there relationships between them? What are the relationships? What's happening between them? But again, each metaphor on its own is being repeated back verbatim exactly as the client said it. Nonverbals are just as much metaphors as the words are. So you might have somebody say to me, my boss just drives me nuts. And so I'll echo that back. And when your boss is driving you nuts, what kind of nuts is that? Echoing the exact body movements. And it may seem to you that when you're doing that to somebody that they're going to think you're parroting them, or they really don't. They think that you're just in tune with them and you're actually echoing back the right thing. So nonverbals are a phenomenal technique for doing this. It's harder in a remote setting because you don't always get the body language cues, but if it's something that if you can echo back, it is phenomenal. The last piece of clean language that I want to illustrate is the power switch. And this is a really good one, even if you don't do anything else with clean language. It's a really good technique to get people out of a bad state. Because sometimes you'll meet up with somebody and they're just in a bad mood. They just came out of a horrible meeting, or things went wrong on the way to work, and they're in that bad state. And you know that if they stay in that bad state, you're not going to be able to help them with any of the things that they need to do. So the power switch is a quick way to get that. So if they say, oh, I missed the bus this morning and it's just the most horrible day. And when you miss the bus, what would you like to have happen? And initially they might look at you and say, well, that's kind of stupid. What are you asking? Just ask it again. And as you cycle around, they will get to a point that they're in a much more positive state. It works with just about everybody. I can assure you it works with teenagers because I've done it. I have a teenager at home. And you can lump up a whole bunch of these. So somebody might say, well, it's the most horrible day. I got out of the wrong side of the bed and I tripped over the cat and I banged my knee on the refrigerator and it's just horrible. Well, you can lump them all together. You say, and when you got out of the wrong side of the bed and you tripped over the cat and you banged your knee on the refrigerator, what would you like to have happen? So really, really quick technique to get people in a much more positive state. A quick case study, because I like to make this practical. I've given you a lot of theory so far. Normally when I do this session, I want people to practice it on each other, but we don't have time for that tonight. So I'm going to give you a really quick case study instead. The Australian government regularly sends expeditions down to Antarctica. And it used to be that they would go down, and Antarctica is a hostile environment. You can't go outside without risking your life. You're in closed quarters with the same people over and over again. So it's very hostile, very difficult to work with. And when they came back, they would survey these people, and the results were consistently the most horrible experience of my life. I wish I hadn't gone. It was a disaster. So they tried using clean language to prepare people. And they would get everybody in a room and they would ask clean language questions. When you're performing at your best, you're like what? And somebody might say, well, it's like fireworks going off when I'm performing at my best. And it's like this and it's like that. And using clean questions to unpack some of those things and get deeper into the questions. And then moving on to somebody else. And when you're performing at your best, you're like what? And so by doing this to prepare the expedition, what they found is that now when those teams come back from Antarctica, the survey results said the best experience of my life. I am so happy I went. This was the most awesome thing. What changed? What changed is how they prepared the teams. They prepared them using clean language techniques. So where did this all come from? It came from therapy, as I mentioned. David Grove is a therapist, or was a therapist. He's passed away now in New Zealand, dealing with some fairly serious things around abuse and such. And he developed these language patterns to help people get past their own problems. So really difficult problems, far more complicated than the things we do with coaching. And he found these language patterns that worked really well. Then James Lawley and Penny Tompkins came along and they modeled what he was doing. And they refined it down to a set of these questions, the 12 questions that became clean language. Then Judy Reese, who I believe was a journalist initially, did a phenomenal job of publicizing this and writing books and getting awareness out about clean language. And then Caitlin Walker has taken this and done some phenomenal things around group work. She's also spoken at the big Agile conference. You may have had an opportunity to see what she's done. So Googling any of these people will get some phenomenal results of what's going on with clean language. So we've moved a little bit faster than I'd thought, but that just leaves a lot more time for Q&A. So that's good. I will mention, although I didn't really, when we focused on the words direct attention, one of the key things about that, because ultimately this is what hypnosis is all about. It's using words to direct attention. Just as so much of therapy, we use words to direct attention to get people into a better place, to help them unpack their own problems so that they can solve their own problems for themselves without you often even knowing what the problem was. So whole bunch of links here. I will, as we start into Q&A, I will paste some of these into the chat.
This was great, Mike. Thanks for doing this. There are some questions, and it looks like a few people have joined AgileTO meetups before. So good evening, everyone. My name's Jeff, and I'll be your Q&A moderator for the next 15 minutes or as long as it goes. Please feel free to throw your questions in the chat window, or let me know if you do want to ask a question, and we'll get you unmuted so that you can ask them, or I'm happy to ask them on your behalf. A few people have already sent me messages through the chat saying, hey, Jeff, I've got a couple of questions here for Mike. So let me start with some of them, Mike. And actually, the first one I want to start with is actually from Andy looking at Antarctica. Can you maybe talk about the difference between these clean language questions and what Andy calls quite properly, maybe leading questions?
Well, they are leading questions work in a similar way, that they're trying to direct attention and get us to a specific goal. But the intention behind a leading question is that I'm trying to get you to a specific place. And with clean, I'm absolutely not trying to do that. I'm trying to leave the problem in place and help you see it from different angles so that you can unpack it. There are times that I would deliberately want to contaminate a metaphor, and a leading question would be a good way of doing that. So if you've given me a metaphor that's just not empowering, that's not getting you to the place you want to be, I might want to deliberately contaminate that. But in the case where I'm trying to help you understand, clean is more effective.
But your Antarctica question, you said, if you believe that you're at your best, you feel like, what? That's a leading question.
Well, that's a question. That was not a clean question. Thank you for calling that one out, Andy. That was a leading question to get us thinking in metaphors. Because if I say to somebody, come up with a phrase that's got a metaphor in it, everybody does a complete mental blank. But if I ask you up front, yeah, go ahead.
But you contaminated your question because you don't know if it's because it's a leading question that made the study successful, or it's a clean language that made it successful. If you have to rerun the study, you have to use only the leading questions that are not clean language and see what happens, right? If you do it,
and somebody may do it someday. All
Okay.
I can tell you is that what they have done with clean language has been phenomenally successful.
Okay.
But you're right that initial question was leading, and it was designed to get metaphors out on the table.
Mike, how do you get sometimes people to engage in the language of metaphors in the first place?
And that would be the kind of leading question that I just asked. When things are going exactly as you'd like, they are like what? So now I'm trying to elicit a metaphor. If they just will not give you a metaphor regardless, then you can throw a noun or a verb into these clean questions and it still works, just not as effectively.
Where is this sort of questioning, great question, by the way, thank you for that. Where is this sort of questioning not effective?
Well, it would be not effective in a case where I did deliberately want to lead somebody somewhere. It's very specific use case is to help you understand what's going on in your own head without contaminating that. That's the use case that we would use clean for. And so there's lots of situations where I don't want to do that. There's situations where I want to take you to a different place.
Interesting. Okay. Do you have some examples maybe of how you could, someone's raised the point here that it sounds like this could become very repetitive, and they actually reference the idea of somebody who's taken a coaching course and thinks they're a great coach because every question they ask is, and what else? And that just gets repetitive after probably the second or third time asking it. Have you experienced that, or do you have any sort of ideas on how to get out of that constant asking the same question over and over?
Yes. So first of all, in a coaching context, I typically don't stay exclusively clean. I'll throw a couple of clean questions in here and there. If this was a therapy context, or if I was actually trying to get somebody past a phobia, because I do also study hypnotherapy, if I was doing that, then I might stay exclusively with clean and just keep going around. And I don't care if I'm repetitious at that point, because we're in a relationship where I know we're trying to get you to a better place. In a coaching environment, we're trying to have a more casual conversation, and then I don't want to appear that I'm repeating things over and over again. So I would throw in a couple of clean language squared. If you give me a juicy metaphor, I'm going to jump on that metaphor, and then I'm going to move on to something else.
Nice. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. There's one more in here that I'm trying. Oh, good, another one. Let me jump back to this one. Shoot, I just lost it. Scott actually asked a question earlier, and Scott, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself here because I think it was context specific at the time when you asked, "What do you mean by nuts?" And I think that was in relationship to something Mike said explicitly at that time.
Yep, and it could go with any of these, like, what do you mean by X, right? Or sorry, refresh me again. What was the clean language question?
What kind of X is that? Or is
Kind
there
of
anything
X.
else about X?
Yeah, so how are those questions different than what do you mean by X?
Well, we're trying to get deeper without, as soon as I ask for a meaning, you're going to start going in a slightly different direction. You're going to be overanalyzing instead of just reacting. This is a hypnotic language pattern. And so we're very deliberately trying not to manipulate in any one direction. There's lots of places where I would want to, but this is a case where I don't. So if I'm asking for meaning, I'm forcing you to, that's more of a leading question. I'm forcing you in a different direction.
Is that good, Scott?
I'm not sure I quite gel with that, but
all right.
What do you mean by that could be like wide open, but when you say what kind of that, that's kind of narrowing you down into something. I feel.
Well, exactly, but I'm asking you to identify what it is. You know, what kind of it is. So I'm assuming that there is a kind, there is a presupposition in there.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying to get you to think your way around the problem more effectively.
Maybe, I don't know, Mike, if there's an opportunity to get an example in here, but we've got a great question in here of specifically using clean language for teams that are working in agile environments. Do you have an example of a conversation that you've had perhaps recently with a team that you can share how you used some of this language maybe?
I don't tend to use a lot of clean in a team's context, but I can explain how it is done. Caitlin Walker does a lot of phenomenal work with teams. She started working with troubled youth, and then she moved on to working in corporate environments today. She has a brilliant TED Talk that we should probably get the URL for and put it in the chat here. But the idea is that she'll go around and she'll ask the question, you know, when you're performing at your best, you're like what? Starting off with the leading question. And then when somebody answers, well, you know, I am like the water fountain in this way, she'll ask a couple of questions to unpack it, but she'll never ask more than 2 or 3 before she moves to somebody else in the same group. And she'll say, and who's different from that? Okay, so you were like the water fountain, who's different? Oh, and I'm like the fireworks. Okay, we'll unpack a little bit of the fireworks, but no more than 2 or 3 questions. And then we move on, and who's different from that? And so that's how she'll work the room, and she'll go around and she'll find out how all the different perspectives that are going on. And it's phenomenal for building up team relationships. I have seen Caitlin do this in person, getting some really tough emotional issues up and on the surface very, very quickly.
I can imagine it must be tough sometimes to get people to react to those questions or respond to them, because you really are pushing them down, as you sort of alluded to at the beginning, to not just respond, but to actually have to think about how I am when I'm at my best.
Right, right. And that's the whole point. If they're not if they just give you back the quick answer, then your clean question didn't really work. You want them to sit and think. If you can see their eyes defocusing a bit, or if their face goes a bit flush, you've got them in exactly the right spot. They went deeper to look for that answer. But if it's just, oh yeah, I'm fine, then they didn't think about it at all. That was just a quick thought being returned.
Andy's joined in for a second question here, asking about, isn't this a form of parallel talking about the elephant in the room, for example? And yes, he's very clear that he's explicitly using a metaphor in that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by parallel talking.
It's because sometimes you want to talk about the issue. You're not talking about the PO, but you talk the metaphors about the PO, for example, or a teammate.
Oh, okay.
So can you use
right? So you just want some distance from the real problem. You don't want to focus on the actual problem. You want to take a step back from it. We're sort of doing that at an unconscious level, but we're not explicitly doing that, or not as far as the client is aware. If I needed to do that, I probably wouldn't have picked clean as the thing I wanted to work with. Then I might do something. There's a whole bunch of stuff. Lego Serious Play, for example, is phenomenal at doing exactly what you said. I don't want to talk about the real problem. I want to talk about it in a safer sense. And so I'm going to build a Lego model, or we're going to build a shared Lego model, which is representative of that big thing. So clean would not be my first choice for that problem.
Any thoughts, Mike, on avoiding contaminating the conversation? How do you avoid it, and how do you avoid, whether you're conscious of it or not, letting your own biases seep into, or your own perspectives seep in to the sort of conversation that you're having?
Well, the trick is to always make sure that we're only repeating back exactly the metaphors that the client said as they said them. And if you find yourself repeating back something else, then you know you've missed that.
So it's about repeating back the metaphors as the person said it and not bringing in any of your own language. Damn it, I was so close to getting your words back. I didn't quite make it. Mike, this was great. This was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful intro to the topic. I can imagine it being really, really powerful, really engaging when used in an effective and an appropriate way, as you've kind of given us some ideas on here. Thanks, by the way, for the links. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to find out more?
In my contact information is in the chat.
Perfect.
My email, my websites. I have a corporate website that's for me, and I have another one, Unconscious Agile, that is all about the unconscious human behavior things as they relate to Agile. And that's where I write about that stuff.
Awesome. That was wonderful tonight, Mike. Thank you so much.